The wind was a blade, slicing through the thin fabric of her coat. Elara pulled her son closer, trying to shield him with the inadequate warmth of her own body. They were huddled in an alley, a forgotten crevice between two towering buildings that glittered with festive lights. Christmas Eve. The irony was a bitter taste in her mouth, colder than the frost forming on the pavement. She could hear the faint, muffled sound of carols bleeding from a nearby storefront. Songs of joy and peace and plenty. Here, there was only the skittering of trash pushed by the wind and the shallow, fragile rhythm of her son's breathing. Leo, her world, her everything. He shivered in his sleep, his small face pale in the gloom. His hair, the same shade of spun gold as hers, was matted and damp. Guilt was a physical thing, a heavy stone lodged in her chest. She had failed him, utterly and completely. She had run from a monster, only to lead them into this slow, freezing decay. Marcus's voice still echoed in her mind, a venomous whisper. "You're nothing without me. You'll be on the streets." He had been right. She pressed her lips to Leo's forehead. It was cold, too cold. Panic, a familiar predator, began to circle. She had to do something. Beg, steal. She didn't know. The fight had leached out of her over the past few weeks, leaving a hollowed-out shell. Leo stirred, his eyelids fluttering open. His blue eyes, usually so bright with childhood wonder, were clouded with weariness. "Mommy?" he whispered, his voice raspy. "I'm cold." The stone in her chest fractured, sending shards of pain through her entire being. "I know, baby, I know. Try to sleep a little more." He snuggled deeper against her, a movement of pure, trusting love that she felt she no longer deserved. His small hand fumbled in his pocket. He pulled out a treasure, wrapped carefully in a crumpled napkin. A cookie, or half of one. A simple oatmeal raisin cookie he'd been given by a woman outside a bakery 2 days ago. He had eaten half then, and meticulously saved the other half. For when things got really bad, he'd said. He looked at it, then up at her. "Are you hungry, Mommy?" Tears pricked her eyes, hot and sharp. She shook her head, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "No, sweet boy, that's yours." He nodded, tucking it away again as if it were the crown jewels. They lapsed back into silence, a shared misery punctuated by the distant sounds of a city celebrating. Elara closed her eyes, praying for a miracle she didn't believe in, for an end, any end. A sharp sound echoed from the end of the alley, a heavy metal door clanging shut. Elara's body went rigid, her arm tightened around Leo. Footsteps, crisp, confident footsteps on the cold pavement, coming closer. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Danger. It was always danger. She tried to make herself smaller, to melt into the grimy brick wall behind her. She held her breath, willing them to be invisible. The footsteps stopped, right in front of them. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for a harsh word, a kick, a demand to move along. Silence stretched, thick and heavy. Slowly, cautiously, she opened her eyes and looked up. A man stood there, a tall silhouette against the faint light spilling from the street. He was dressed in a long, dark overcoat that spoke of a world so far from hers it might as well have been another planet. His face was in shadow, but she could feel his gaze on them. Julian Vance felt the cold seep into his bones, a familiar chill that had little to do with the winter air. He had just left his office, a gleaming tower of glass and steel with his name on it, Vance Industries. On Christmas Eve, he was the last one to leave. As always, the building was empty. His car was waiting. His home would be empty too, save for the quiet staff and his sleeping daughter. The silence of his life was deafening. It had been 3 years since Amelia died. 3 years of going through the motions, building the empire, raising their daughter, Maya. But the color had drained from his world, leaving only shades of gray. He took a shortcut through the alley, a habit from a lifetime ago, before the driver and the corner office. A way to feel the city's pulse, even for a moment. That's when he saw them, a flicker of movement in the deepest shadow. A woman and a child, huddled together like shipwreck survivors, clinging to a piece of driftwood. He stopped. The sheer desperation in their posture hit him like a physical blow. The woman's face was a mask of terror, her arm wrapped around the boy protectively. He saw the exhaustion etched onto her features, the deep purple smudges under her eyes. He saw the child, small and fragile, shivering against her. His chest ached. He thought of Maya, warm and safe in her bed. The contrast was obscene. He wasn't a man given to impulse. His life was a fortress of logic and careful planning. But this was different. This was a wound in the fabric of the world, right in front of him. The woman was staring at him, her eyes wide with fear. He knew he had to be careful. He was a large man. He could be intimidating. He took a half-step back, trying to appear less threatening. It was then that the boy, who had been hiding his face in his mother's coat, peeked out. He looked at Julian, his gaze direct and curious, not yet clouded by the fear that gripped his mother. Julian's expression must have betrayed him, the loneliness, the hollow ache that never quite went away. The boy saw it. Children see things adults learn to ignore. Leo watched the tall man. He didn't look mean. He looked sad, like the way Mommy sometimes looked when she thought he was asleep. He remembered his cookie. It was for an emergency. But maybe a sad man was a kind of emergency too. He wriggled out from his mother's tight grip, ignoring her hissed whisper of his name. He stood on wobbly legs and fumbled in his pocket. He pulled out the napkin-wrapped treasure. He held it out, a small offering in the vast, cold darkness of the alley. "It's all I have, sir." Leo's small voice was clear and high. "But you can have it. It's Christmas." The half-eaten oatmeal raisin cookie sat in his small, grimy palm. Julian stared. At the cookie, at the boy, at the sheer, staggering innocence of the act. He had been offered multi-million-dollar deals, partnerships, keys to cities. None of it had ever touched him like this. This small, broken offering from a child who had nothing. Something inside Julian, a part of him that he thought had died with Amelia, cracked open. A warmth, painful and intense, flooded his chest. He knelt, bringing himself down to the boy's level. The expensive fabric of his trousers met the filthy ground, but he didn't notice. His eyes met Elara's. He saw her shock, her confusion. Her fear was still there, but it was now laced with bewilderment. He looked back at the boy. His voice was thick when he finally spoke. "Thank you. That's the best gift I've ever received." He didn't take the cookie. Instead, he gently closed the boy's fingers back over it. "But I think you should hold on to it for me." He rose to his full height and looked directly at Elara. His voice was soft, but held an undeniable current of authority. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. "Come with me." Elara stared, paralyzed. Her mind screamed at her. "No, don't trust him. It's a trick. It's always a trick." But her body wouldn't obey. The cold had sunk too deep. The fight was gone. And the man's eyes, they weren't filled with pity or condescension. They were filled with a profound, aching sincerity. She looked at Leo, who was now looking up at her, his expression hopeful. For him. She would do it for him. She gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. The relief that washed over the man's face was stark. He shrugged off his heavy overcoat in one fluid motion. It was cashmere, she noted with a detached part of her brain. Impossibly soft. He didn't hand it to her. He draped it around her and Leo, enveloping them both in its warmth and the faint, clean scent of cedar and something else she couldn't name. It felt like a shield. "My car is just around the corner," he said, his voice gentle. "Let's get you both out of the cold." The ride was a blur. Elara sat in the back of a car so luxurious it felt like a spaceship. The leather was supple, the air was warm. Leo had fallen asleep almost instantly, his head in her lap, his small body finally relaxed in the profound heat. She watched the city lights slide past the tinted windows, feeling utterly disconnected from reality. This couldn't be happening. The man, he had introduced himself as Julian, hadn't asked any questions. He simply drove, his silence a comforting blanket rather than an intimidating void. They left the glittering city center behind, moving into a neighborhood where the houses became estates, hidden behind stone walls and iron gates. The car slowed and turned, passing through a gate that swung open silently. They drove up a long, winding driveway to a house that wasn't a house. It was a monolith of glass and stone, stark and modern, glowing with a cool, reserved light. It was beautiful, but it felt as cold as the alley she had just left. Julian led them inside. The interior was vast, with soaring ceilings and polished marble floors. A grand staircase curved upwards into the shadows. Everything was pristine, minimalist, and silent. It was the home of someone with immense wealth, but not immense joy. It felt less like a home and more like a museum. "My housekeeper is off for the holiday," Julian explained, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. "Please, make yourselves comfortable." The word hung in the air, absurd. How could she ever be comfortable here? She was a stray, brought in from the storm. She felt the grime on her skin, the rips in her jeans. She was a stain on this perfect, sterile environment. She clutched the borrowed coat around her, a talisman against her own unworthiness. A small sound from the top of the stairs made them both look up. A little girl stood there, clutching a stuffed rabbit. She was maybe a year or two older than Leo, with large dark eyes and 2 long braids. She stared down at them, her expression unreadable. "Maya," Julian said softly, "you should be in bed." The girl didn't answer. Her gaze flickered from her father to Elara, then to the sleeping form of Leo in Elara's arms. Her eyes narrowed slightly. It wasn't hostility. It was a guarded, wary assessment. This was her territory, and they were intruders. "This is Elara," Julian said, his voice gentle. "And her son, Leo. They're going to be staying with us for a little while." Maya's gaze lingered on Elara for a long moment before she turned without a word and disappeared back into the darkness of the upper floor. The rejection, quiet as it was a clear signal. Julian sighed, a quiet breath of frustration and sadness. "She's had a hard time since her mother passed." Elara just nodded, the weight of her own situation pressing down on her again. What was she doing here? She was bringing her brokenness into this man's already fractured home. Julian showed them to a guest suite that was larger than any apartment Elara had ever lived in. It had a bedroom with a cloud-like bed and an attached bathroom made of marble and chrome. He brought them clothes, pajamas for Leo, and a soft sweatsuit for her that belonged to his late wife. Elara's hands trembled as she took them. They smelled faintly of lavender. "There's food in the kitchen if you're hungry," he said from the doorway. "Please, take whatever you need. Get some rest. We can talk in the morning." He left, closing the door softly behind him. Elara gently laid Leo on the massive bed. He didn't stir. She ran a hot bath, the steam filling the room, and scrubbed away the days of grime. Dressed in the borrowed sweatsuit, she felt a little more human, but no less of an imposter. She couldn't sleep. She sat in a chair by the window, looking out at the manicured grounds, bathed in moonlight. It was a perfect, peaceful picture. But peace felt alien. Her body was still wired for danger, for flight. She was safe, for now. But she was a burden, a charity case. The thought chafed, raw and painful. The next few days passed in a strange, dreamlike state. Julian was a phantom in his own house, disappearing to his home office for hours on end, his face etched with the gravity of his work. But he made sure they had everything they needed. Food appeared, clothes were provided. He treated her with a quiet, profound respect that was more unnerving than any overt kindness. He didn't press her for her story, he simply gave her space. Leo, on the other hand, blossomed. After a day of shy observation, the warmth and security of the house worked their magic. He explored the vast rooms with wide-eyed wonder. He discovered a playroom filled with more toys than he had ever seen, but his primary interest was Maya. He would follow her around at a careful distance, a small, hopeful satellite orbiting a distant, icy planet. Maya ignored him. She would read in a corner, her face impassive. She would draw, her back turned to him. If he spoke to her, she would offer a monosyllabic reply or simply walk away. Elara watched them, her heart aching for both of them. She saw Leo's hopeful loneliness and Maya's defensive solitude. Elara kept to herself, trying to be as invisible as possible. She cleaned the guest suite meticulously. She washed their few belongings in the high-tech laundry room. She felt a desperate need to earn her keep, to not be a complete parasite. One afternoon, she found herself in the enormous, state-of-the-art kitchen. It was gleaming and unused. A private chef prepared most of the family's meals. But the chef was off for the week. Julian and Maya had been eating simple, catered meals that Maya barely touched. Elara noticed that Maya always left the crusts on her sandwiches. She noticed that she pushed the green beans to the side of her plate. On an impulse, Elara opened the refrigerator. It was stocked with the finest organic ingredients. She found chicken, carrots, celery, onions. She began to cook. The motions were familiar, grounding. She made a simple chicken noodle soup from scratch, the way her grandmother had taught her. The aroma, rich and savory, began to fill the sterile silence of the house. It smelled like home. It smelled like care. When it was ready, she ladled it into bowls. She used a small star-shaped cookie cutter she found in a drawer to cut the sandwiches. She made for the children, leaving no crusts. She set the table in the small, sunlit breakfast nook, a space that looked less used than the rest of the house. Julian emerged from his study, drawn by the smell. He stopped in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Maya came downstairs, drawn by the same scent. She saw the table, the steaming bowls of soup, the star-shaped sandwiches. She looked at Elara, a flicker of something. Surprise? Curiosity? in her dark eyes. They ate in silence at first. Then Leo slurped his soup with gusto. "This is the best soup ever, Mommy." Julian looked at his bowl. He looked at Elara. "This is... thank you." Maya ate her soup. She ate every drop. And then she ate her crustless, star-shaped sandwich. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. It was the first crack in the ice. That night, a storm rolled in, rattling the large glass windows. Elara lay awake, listening to the wind and the rain, her old anxieties stirring. A cry pierced the silence of the house, a child's scream of terror. Elara was out of bed in an instant, her maternal instincts overriding everything else. She followed the sound down the hall to Maya's room. The door was ajar. Julian was already there, standing beside his daughter's bed, his hand on her shoulder. "Shh, Maya, it's okay. It's just a dream." But the girl was thrashing, caught in the grip of a nightmare. "Mommy!" she cried out, her voice filled with panic and loss. Julian's face was a portrait of helpless agony. He was a man who could command boardrooms and move markets, but he was powerless against his own child's grief. Elara hesitated at the door, feeling like an intruder, but the sound of Maya's distress was a pull she couldn't resist. She walked softly into the room. Julian looked up, his eyes filled with a desperate plea for help he didn't know how to ask for. Elara sat on the other side of the bed. She didn't touch Maya. She simply began to hum. It was an old lullaby, a simple, gentle tune her own mother used to sing to her. Her voice was soft, not perfect, but steady. It was a sound of pure, uncomplicated comfort. Slowly, miraculously, Maya's thrashing began to subside. Her frantic cries softened into whimpers. The rigid terror in her small body started to uncoil. She was still asleep, but she turned her head toward the sound of the humming. Elara kept humming, her voice a soft thread of sound in the dark, stormy room. She saw the tension leave Julian's shoulders. He watched her, his expression a mixture of gratitude and awe. Finally, Maya's breathing evened out. She settled into a deep, peaceful sleep. Elara quietly slipped out of the room. Julian followed her into the hallway. "How did you?" he started, his voice rough with emotion. "Sometimes," Elara said softly, "they just need to hear a different voice." He just stared at her, the silence between them charged with unspoken things. "Thank you," he finally whispered. The next morning, Elara woke to find a piece of paper slipped under her door. She picked it up. It was a drawing, a crayon drawing of 4 stick figures. A tall man, a woman with long yellow hair, a small boy, and a slightly taller girl. They were all standing under a brightly colored rainbow, and they were all holding hands. At the bottom, in shaky, childish letters, was a single word: Maya. Elara sank onto the bed, clutching the drawing to her chest. A tear, not of sorrow, but of something fragile and new, slipped down her cheek. A seed of trust had been planted. A week turned into 2. A fragile routine began to form. Elara found her place not as a guest, but as a quiet presence of warmth in the cold house. She cooked simple, comforting meals. She read stories to Leo and, eventually, to a silent but attentive Maya, who would sit just close enough to hear. The house began to feel less like a museum and more like a home. There was the sound of children's laughter echoing in the halls sometimes, the smell of baking bread, small, human things. Elara still felt the precariousness of her position. She was living in a fairy tale, and she knew that clocks could strike midnight. But for the first time in a very long time, she could breathe. The constant, gnawing fear had receded to a dull ache. She saw the change in Julian, too. The deep lines of exhaustion around his eyes seemed to soften. He started leaving his study earlier. He would sit in the kitchen while she cooked, watching her with a quiet intensity that made her skin prickle. He didn't talk about his work. She didn't talk about her past. They existed in a bubble of unspoken understanding. But the past doesn't stay buried forever. One night, sleep was a slippery, elusive thing. Elara gave up, pulling on a robe and making her way downstairs, seeking a glass of water, a moment of quiet. She found Julian in the kitchen, staring out the massive window at the moonlit garden. He was holding a framed photograph. He didn't seem surprised to see her. "I can't sleep either," he said, his voice low. She stood beside him, a respectful distance between them. She glanced at the photo. A beautiful woman with a radiant smile stood next to a younger, happier-looking Julian. Amelia. "She loved this garden," he said, his thumb stroking the glass. "She planted every one of those rose bushes. She used to say, 'A house isn't a home until you've put your hands in the dirt.'" He was silent for a long moment. "I built this place for her, this monument. I thought if I gave her everything, I could keep her safe, happy." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "All the money in the world, and I couldn't stop a random blood clot in her brain." His voice cracked on the last words. The confession hung in the air, raw and exposed. "I've been trying to hold it all together for Maya," he continued, his voice barely a whisper, "to be a father and a mother. But I'm failing. The house was getting colder, quieter. I was losing her. Before you came, I was drowning, and I didn't even realize it." He turned to face her, his eyes dark with a pain that mirrored her own. "You and Leo, you brought life back into this place. You brought it back into me." The sincerity in his voice was a key, turning a lock deep inside her. The wall she had so carefully constructed around her own story began to crumble. "He told me I was nothing," she heard herself say, the words spilling out, soft and shaky. "That I couldn't survive without him. And for a while, I believed him." She told him everything. About Marcus, about the charm that had curdled into control, the love that had twisted into possession, the little criticisms that became cruelties. The night she finally found the courage to grab Leo and run with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a few dollars stuffed in her pocket. "I was so scared," she whispered, wrapping her arms around herself. "Not for me, for Leo. I didn't want him to grow up thinking that was normal, that was love." She finally looked at him, expecting to see pity, but she didn't. She saw anger, a fierce, protective anger, directed not at her, but at the man who had hurt her. And she saw a deep, profound respect. "You're not nothing, Elara," Julian said, his voice firm, resolute. "You're the strongest person I've ever met." He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. His words were an embrace, a validation she hadn't known she was starving for. In the quiet, moonlit kitchen, two broken people shared the pieces of their past, and in that sharing, a new bond was forged, not of gratitude or circumstance, but of a deep, mutual understanding, a bond of shared wounds. The bubble, however, was destined to pop. Life settled into a rhythm that felt almost real. Elara enrolled Leo in the local preschool with Maya. She found a purpose in creating a home. Julian was no longer a phantom, he was a partner. They parented the children together, a natural, unspoken team. The feeling growing between them was undeniable, a quiet, powerful current. But they never named it. It was too fragile, too new. One afternoon, Julian came home early. His face was a thundercloud. He was holding a tablet, his knuckles white. "What is it?" Elara asked, a cold dread seeping into her veins. He hesitated, then turned the screen toward her. It was a trashy online gossip column. The headline was splashy and cruel. Billionaire CEO Julian Vance's newest charity project, a homeless beauty and her son move in. The article was filled with speculative garbage, but it was the photo that made Elara's blood run cold. It was a picture of her, taken from a distance, walking with Leo into the preschool. And below it, in the comments section, was a name: Marcus Thorne. "That's my Elara and my son, Leo. I've been worried sick. I had no idea she was in such trouble. Thank God this kind man found them. I just want my family back." The air left Elara's lungs. The world tilted, the safe, warm kitchen dissolving around her. She was back in the alley. She was back in that suffocating apartment, with his voice coiling around her neck. "I'll always find you." "No," she breathed, shaking her head. "No, no, no." The tablet slipped from her numb fingers and clattered to the floor. "Elara?" Julian's voice was sharp, cutting through her panic. "He knows where I am," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "He knows." Her first primal instinct took over: flight. "I have to go," she said, her voice frantic. She started moving, her actions jerky and panicked. "I have to take Leo and go. I can't let him find us here. He'll hurt you. He'll try to take your money. He'll ruin you just to get to me." She was babbling, making for the stairs, for the room, for escape. Julian moved, blocking her path. He placed his hands gently on her shoulders, holding her in place. "No," he said, his voice a low, unshakable command. "You don't understand," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "He's a monster. He will destroy everything you've built to punish me for leaving." "Let him try," Julian said, his eyes blazing with a cold fire she had never seen before. It was the look of a man who did not lose battles. "Elara, listen to me." He tightened his grip slightly, forcing her to meet his gaze. "You are not running anywhere. This is your home now. Your fight is over. This one is mine." The sheer certainty in his voice was an anchor in her storm of panic. "He called you his family," Julian said, his voice laced with contempt. "We are your family. Leo is my son. Maya is your daughter. And you are mine to protect." It was a declaration, a promise, a line drawn in the sand. The terror didn't vanish, but for the first time, it was met by a force even stronger. She sagged against him, the fight to flee draining out of her, replaced by a fragile, trembling hope. Julian's response was immediate and absolute. Within an hour, a discreet security team was in place. His legal team, a pack of the city's sharpest lawyers, was assembled in his study. He was no longer the quiet, grieving man. He was Julian Vance, the titan of industry, and he was moving his pieces into place. Marcus, true to form, escalated. He gave an interview, painting himself as a heartbroken father, desperately searching for his missing son, manipulated by a mentally unstable woman. He fed the media a carefully crafted story of concern. He filed for custody of Leo. The threat was no longer a comment on a website. It was a legal siege. Elara was terrified. She was forced to give a deposition, to recount the years of abuse to a team of strangers. Every word was like swallowing broken glass. But Julian was there. He sat beside her through every meeting, his presence a silent, unyielding support. He never flinched. He never doubted. His lawyers were ruthless and efficient. They dug into Marcus's life, uncovering a history of debt, of shady dealings, of other women who had been charmed and then discarded. They found a police report Elara had been too scared to follow up on years ago. The public narrative began to shift. The final confrontation happened in a sterile courtroom for a preliminary hearing. Elara had to face Marcus. He sat across the room, looking polished and concerned. When his eyes met hers, he gave her a small, confident smile. A smile that said, "See, I told you, you can't escape me." But this time, she wasn't alone. Julian was beside her. His hand rested on the small of her back, a warm, solid pressure. When Marcus's lawyer began to question Elara, painting her as an unfit, unstable mother who had kidnapped her own child, Julian's lawyer calmly dismantled him. They presented the evidence, the financial records, the testimony from another woman Marcus had terrorized, the old police report. The judge, a stern-faced woman, looked at Marcus, her expression hardening. The concerned father act was crumbling under the weight of cold, hard facts. The judge granted Elara a permanent restraining order. She dismissed Marcus's custody claim with prejudice, her voice sharp with disdain. "Mr. Thorne," the judge said, her voice ringing with finality, "you are to have no contact with Ms. Ross or her son. Any attempt to do so will be met with the full force of the law. This court does not take kindly to the manipulation of the justice system to harass victims of domestic abuse." It was over. Just like that. The monster was declawed. The threat was neutralized. Walking out of the courthouse, Elara felt the sun on her face, as if for the first time. The weight she had carried for years, a crushing burden on her soul, had finally, blessedly, lifted. She was free, truly free. She looked at Julian, who was watching her, his expression soft. Tears filled her eyes, but for the first time, they were tears of pure, unadulterated relief. She didn't need to say anything. He understood. Back at the house, life resumed. But something had fundamentally shifted. The last shadow had been banished. The sanctuary was no longer temporary. It was permanent. The unspoken thing between them was no longer fragile. It was a solid, tangible presence in the house, as real as the walls and the roof. A few weeks later, they were all in the garden. It was a perfect spring day. Julian was pushing Maya on a swing. Elara was helping Leo plant a small patch of marigolds, his small hands covered in dirt. It was a simple, domestic moment, a perfect tableau of happiness. Leo, patting the soil around a flower, looked up at Julian. "Julian," he asked with the simple directness of a child, "are you going to be my new dad?" The question hung in the sun-drenched air. Maya stopped swinging, her feet dragging on the ground. She looked from Leo to her father, her expression intensely hopeful. "And will Elara be my new mommy?" she asked, her voice small. The world seemed to hold its breath. Julian walked over to where Elara was kneeling in the dirt. He knelt in front of her, mirroring her position, the knees of his expensive trousers pressing into the soft earth. He took her soil-stained hands in his. "Elara Ross," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that made her heart ache. "You came into my life like a whisper and became a roar. You saved me and my daughter in ways you will never understand. You taught us that a house is just a building, but a family is a home." His eyes, dark and sincere, held hers. "I know I don't have a ring. I know this isn't some grand gesture, but I can't imagine another day of my life without you in it, without you and Leo." He took a deep breath. "The children have a question for us. but I have one for you first." He squeezed her hands. "Will you marry me? Will you let us be your family forever?" It wasn't a demand. It wasn't an expectation. It was a question, filled with hope and vulnerability. He was giving her the choice, the power she had never had. Tears streamed freely down her face, watering the marigolds at her knees. Tears of joy, of release, of a happiness so profound it felt like it might break her open. She looked from Julian's hopeful face to the two children watching them, their own faces alight with anticipation. Her family. She nodded, unable to speak. Then she found her voice, a whisper that held the weight of her entire world. "Yes," she said. "Yes, 1,000 times. Yes." A cheer erupted from the children. Maya ran and threw her arms around Elara's neck. Leo launched himself at Julian, who caught him in a one-armed hug, his other hand still holding tight to Elara's. And in the middle of the garden his first wife had planted, surrounded by the new life they had nurtured together, Julian Vance and Elara Ross sealed their future not with a diamond, but with a promise born from shared pain and cemented by a fierce, protective love. The wedding was not a grand affair for the society pages. It was held in the garden under the shade of an old oak tree on a warm summer afternoon. The only guests were the 4 of them and a quiet judge to make it official. Elara wore a simple white dress. Julian wore a light gray suit, no tie. Maya, the maid of honor, had woven a crown of wildflowers for Elara's hair. She stood beside her, holding a small bouquet from the garden, her face glowing with a serene happiness that had long been absent. Leo, the best man, stood beside Julian, wearing a tiny, serious suit. He held a small velvet box in his hands with solemn importance. When the moment came, Leo opened the box. Inside were 2 simple, elegant bands. As Julian slid the ring onto Elara's finger, his hands were steady. "I chose you," he said, his voice for her alone. When she slid the ring onto his, her voice was clear and strong. "And I chose you." After the judge pronounced them husband and wife, there was no applause, only a profound and joyful silence. Then Leo tugged on Julian's jacket. "I have a present for you," he announced. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an object wrapped in a pristine white napkin. He handed it to Julian. Inside was a single, perfectly whole oatmeal raisin cookie. "This time you can have the whole thing," Leo said seriously, "because now we can share everything." Julian's composure broke. He laughed, a deep, genuine sound of pure joy, and swept Leo up into a hug. At the same time, Maya came to Elara and shyly held out her wrist. Tied around it was a simple, braided bracelet made of colorful embroidery floss. She held up a matching one. "For you," she said, her voice soft. "So we match, like mothers and daughters are supposed to." Elara knelt and let Maya tie the bracelet around her wrist. It was a simple, childish thing, but it felt more precious than any diamond. It was a symbol of acceptance, of a bond forged not by blood, but by choice and by love. She pulled Maya into a fierce hug, burying her face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her daughter. Her daughter. Later, as the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the lawn, they sat on a blanket, sharing a simple picnic supper. The grand, sterile mansion loomed behind them, but it looked different now. Its windows glowed with a warm, inviting light. It looked like a home. Julian lay on his back, with Leo curled up on his chest, fast asleep. Elara sat beside them, her head resting on his shoulder, with Maya leaning against her, drowsy and content. She looked at the man beside her, the protector who had become her partner. She looked at the boy who had offered a broken cookie and received a world in return. She looked at the girl who had hidden behind a wall of grief and had found the courage to love again. She thought of the woman huddled in the alley, broken and hopeless. She seemed like a ghost from another life. Her past was not erased, but it no longer defined her. It was simply the long, dark road that had, against all odds, led her here, to this moment, to this family. Julian turned his head, his lips brushing her hair. "Happy?" he whispered. Elara smiled, a real bone-deep smile that reached her eyes. More than I ever knew was possible. They had found each other in the darkness, two fractured souls and two lonely children. And together, piece by broken piece, they had built something beautiful, something whole.